With watercolour painting, you can create evocative and decorative works of art using techniques that once mastered will set your creativity free. Whether you want to fashion realistic still lifes and landscapes, or make paintings that suggest forms and feelings with subtle use of colours and shapes, watercolour allows you virtually unlimited scope to express yourself. We'll describe the techniques you need to create some captivating paintings and show example projects that make use of the essential skills and that will inspire you to create your own works of art. Starting with the basics of preparing the paper and mixing colours, we move on to a guide to the most important brushes, including how to use them and what they do best, from the delicate rigger brush, excellent for fine detail, to the flat brush, an essential and versatile tool that can create some special effects, such as wavy lines. We cover the technique of applying colour so that it goes from dark to light on the paper, and what happens when you lay one colour over another on dry or wet surfaces, plus how to make different types of wash, where colour is laid over large areas of paper. As well as exploring the techniques of palette, paper, paints and brushes, we show you how to make copying a picture easy by drawing it into a grid to give you an outline to work to. Then with 5 projects, 3 landscapes and 2 still lifes, we show how to use the skills described. There is a realistic landscape of open fields created with the help of a drawing from a photograph and using a sponge to create foliage of a tree. A tranquil view of distant hills using a sequence of washes to give an impression of distance. And a view of a cluster of trees including shrubby undergrowth and grass, subjects that often appear difficult but that can be simplified to create an attractive and realistic painting. Flower painting is extremely popular with watercolourists, and a vase of anemones shows exactly what can be achieved using multi-layered paints to give the colourful petals life and depth. Plus clever use of colour suggests the glass and water of a vase. And fruit on a table shows how shadow and reflection add realism to a still life of citrus fruits on a table. Now over to our expert, who's going to show you how it's done. We hope you enjoy watching your DVD and discovering how to create some memorable watercolours.
Flowers in a vase are a favourite subject for watercolourists, and what could be more appealing than the dramatic contrasts in colour provided by anemones with their bright hues and dark centres. For this project, you'll need to be using a number of the basic techniques, including various types of brushwork, working from light to dark, wet on wet and wet on dry. This project is painted directly from the subject, but the drawing can be very basic. Make sure, however, that the subject almost touches the edges of the paper, otherwise you're left with too much empty background space around the flowers. Before you apply the colour, sketch in the flowers on a sheet of stretched knot paper 11 inches by 15 using a 2B lead pencil. The red petals come first, so mix alizarin and cadmium red with plenty of water to get a deep, bright red. Test the colour on a separate sheet of paper before you apply it. Paint the petals of the red flowers using the tip of the number 8 brush to get a crisp, irregular outline to each petal. Paint the outline of the petal first, then drag the colour into the petal to get a solid shape. Leave the white area around the flower centres as unpainted white. While the red petals are still wet, paint the purple petals in a diluted mixture of dioxidine purple and ultramarine. Allow the red and purple to run together in the wet-on-wet technique where the two colours meet. Allow the painting to partially dry before moving on to the next stage. For the first Petal Shadows, mix slightly stronger versions of the red and purple colours. With the number 5 brush, pick out the darker areas where the petals overlap or where there are shadows in the grooves on the petals. Keep the shapes sharp and crisp, using the tip of the brush to paint narrow shadows. Allow the painting to dry partially. The leaves and stems come next, so mix a leafy green from cadmium lemon, sap green and phthalo green with plenty of water. Using the 3/4 inch flat brush, paint the leaves in spiky strokes, alternating between the broad and narrow bristle edges to create both wide and narrow strokes. Don't attempt to paint every leaf accurately, aim to give a general impression. Add a little cadmium red to the green mixture and use this to paint the pinkish green stems using the No. 5 round brush. Leave gaps in the paint where stems are behind others so that the overlying stems stand out clearly. Notice the slight distortion of the stems where they go into the water. Allow the painting to dry completely before moving on to the next stage. Anemones have dark flower centres, so for these, darken the purple petal mixture with Payne's grey and a little of the green leaf mixture. Use this on the No. 5 brush to paint the dark centres to the flowers, leaving the surrounding white areas unpainted. To shadow the leaves, mix sap green with a little dioxidine purple and add the shadows using the 3/4 inch flat brush. Vary the tones by adding dabs of palette purple and allowing the wet colours to run. Paint around the main stems. Allow the painting to dry completely. The stamens are even darker than the flower centres, so add dioxidine purple to the palette green mixture to get a dark tone that's almost black. Using the rigger brush, dot in the tiny stamens around the flower. A third, deeper hue on the petals completes the flowers. For the red petals, mix cadmium red and alizarin with a little of the palette purple. Using the narrow edge of the 3/4 inch flat brush, paint the fine ridges on the red petals. Vary the width of the ridges by using both the narrow and broad edges of the bristles. Still using the 3/4 inch flat brush, add the ridges and deepest shadows to the purple petals with a strong mixture of dioxazine purple and ultramarine. Again, use both the narrow and broad edges of the bristles to vary the width of the ridges. Now the flowers are complete, it's time to use paint to suggest the water in the vase. Mix Payne's Grey and Ultramarine with a little of the green mixtures on the palette. Dilute this with plenty of water and use the No. 5 round brush to paint the pale shadows on the glass. Vary the shadow mixtures with touches of dioxazine purple and the red mixtures already on your palette. Leave streaks of unpainted white paper to suggest the highlights on the glass, and leave a narrow band of unpainted white paper around the top of the water. The last thing you need to do is to define the glass and the water. So, with the No. 5 brush, paint a narrow band of shadow just underneath the surface of the water, using a mixture of the palette reds and greens. Use the same mixture to define the bottom of the glass jar. The anemones, with their fine foliage and gorgeous colours, make a great subject, one that's extremely attractive when captured in watercolour. This is a simple, still life painting of fruit, composed of a colourful arrangement of circular and elliptical shapes, in which the colour of each fruit is reflected in the other fruits. These reflections are painted wet in wet, with the colours being allowed to run slightly into the surrounding ones. For this project, you'll be using a number of the basic techniques, including laying washes, various types of brushwork, wet on wet and wet on dry. Before you start painting, make a light outline of the subject using a 2B pencil. The first thing to do is to block in the fruit following the outline. Begin by making a diluted mixture of cadmium lemon and yellow with water, and use the No. 8 brush to paint the rind and segments of the cut orange, using the tip of the brush to pick out the fine lines in the segments. Add a little cadmium orange to the mixture and paint the uncut orange using fine crisscross lines on the highlights to allow flecks of unpainted white paper to represent the highlights. Allow the painting to dry. Paint the lemon in cadmium lemon, leaving the highlights as flecks of white created by crisscross strokes. Add a little phthalo green to the lemon mixture and use this to paint the reflected green from the lime, allowing the wet colours to blend using the wet in wet technique. Use the same colour to paint the lime, again leaving highlights using tiny crisscross strokes. The basic shapes are now complete, and it's now time to develop the fruits, starting with the oranges. Mix a strong cadmium orange on the palette. Using the rigger brush, define the peel on the cut orange. Add cadmium yellow to the mixture and darken the separate segments using the tip of the brush. Allow flecks of the underlying colour to show through to give the impression of juicy highlights. Use the same cadmium orange to darken the uncut orange. Add tiny touches of palette green to vary the peel colour. Add cadmium red to the mixture and flood this into the wet orange, allowing the paint to puddle along the lower part of the fruit. Dot in the colour around the highlights to create the dimpled texture of the peel. Next comes the lemon. Mix cadmium yellow with touches of palette green and palette orange mixtures. Use the rigger to paint the shadows on the lemon, dotting around the dimpled highlights. Add a little more green mixture to the paint and add the green reflected from the lime. Add more orange mixture and the warm shadow on the lower part of the fruit, which picks up the reflected colour of the wooden table. Allow the painting to dry. For the shadows on the lime, mix phthalo green with dioxidine purple and paint the shadows with the rigger. Use the rigger for the tiny dots around the dappled highlights, then paint the shaded side of the fruit a solid colour. Darken the shadow mixture with a tiny touch of cadmium red and more dioxidine purple, and strengthen the shaded underside of the lime. Allow the painting to dry. Now it's time to add the darkest colour to the uncut orange. Mix a dull orange from cadmium orange and a touch of dioxidine purple for the shadows on ridges on the uncut orange. Apply this with the rigger brush. Strengthen the colour with more cadmium orange and paint the deepest shadows, blending them into the existing with water. Allow the painting to dry. Finish off the fruit by adding the darkest shadows to the lemon and lime. Mix a dense limey yellow by mixing cadmium lemon yellow with a touch of palette green mixture. Apply this to the darkest areas of the lemon using the rigger brush. Add a touch of palette brown to suggest the reflected shadow from the tabletop. Add a touch more of palette green to the same mixture and paint the green reflections of the lime on the lemon. Mix a cool tone from orange and green palette mixtures with an added touch of dioxidine purple and paint the shadow on the lime. For the shadows on the tabletop, mix cadmium orange, raw sienna, cadmium lemon and raw umber to get a burnt orangey colour. After testing the colour on a separate sheet of paper, paint the table shadows with the number 8 brush, taking the colour around the fruit shapes. The shadows are slightly darker where they touch the fruit, so add a little more dioxidine purple to the mixture for these areas. Add a little phthalo green to the mixture and use the rigger brush to paint the greenish shadow under the lime. Allow the painting to dry. Finally, dip the rigger brush into the existing shadow mixture and use this to strengthen the darkest table shadows where the fruit meets the tabletop. Vary the shadow colour slightly with touches of Payne's grey and dark palette mixtures. The end result catches the bold shapes of the fruits in delicate citrus shades and shows the interplay of colours between the fruits themselves and between them and the dark solid mass of the table below. This simple yet evocative landscape is created with 4 washes of overlaid colour and does not need an outline drawing. To create the effect of distance, this project makes use of atmospheric perspective, where objects in the distance are fainter than those in the foreground. To create this effect, it uses progressively darker washes of colour, working from light to dark. It makes use of techniques including laying washes, applying wet paint on dry, and various types of brushwork. Start by creating the colour for the first wash. To get the very pale wash colour you need, load the palette with water using a mop brush and add cobalt blue and cerulean blue. Test this on a separate sheet of paper to see if the colour's correct and be sure to mix plenty of it. Start at the top of the paper and lay this pale flat wash across the whole painting with the mop brush. Work quickly, applying the colour in broad overlapping stripes. Pick up the excess colour from the bottom of the paper and allow the colour to dry. Now darken the wash colour with touches of Payne's grey and dioxidine purple. Again, test this on a separate sheet of paper to see if the colour's correct. Using the mop brush, paint an irregular horizon line and continue to take the wash downwards towards the bottom of the paper using broad overlapping stripes, laying the wet paint over the dry. Allow the colour to dry. Once more, darken the wash by again adding a few touches of Payne's grey to the mixture. It should now be slightly darker than before when you test it on a separate sheet of paper. Using this darker wash, paint another irregular horizon beneath the first, leaving a patch of the former wash to depict the furthest hills. Take the colour downwards to the bottom of the paper as before. The hills are now complete. Allow the colour to dry. For the foreground trees, add still more Payne's grey and also some dioxidine purple to the existing mixture. Test it on a separate sheet before changing to the 3/4 inch flat brush and adding the silhouettes of a few trees. When you've done that, change back to the mop brush. Continue across the paper in an irregular line, and then fill in below, taking this darker colour in a wash all the way to the bottom of the paper. These darker, recognisable shapes establish the foreground, so emphasising the sense of distance and space in the rest of the painting. Varied brushwork makes for a lively painting, and the size and type of brush you use determines the size and shape of the mark you make. So experiment and practice to discover what you can achieve both by using different brushes and by using individual brushes in different ways. Here, 6 important brushes are covered, showing a range of marks each can make. The rigger gets its name because it was used by marine painters for painting the rigging on boats. It has long, fine bristles and is good for detail and fine line work. It's also useful for painting lines of regular thickness. The rigger can be used for zigzag marks made without lifting the brush. These are useful for grasses and landscape textures. Another rigger technique allows you to create fine squiggles of even width. Long crisscross lines of even width make bold geometric patterns. While short, fine lines can be used to make branches, for instance. It's also used for flecks of regular shape and size. And to paint precise shapes, starting with the outline and pulling wet colour to fill in. Finally, using the side of the rigger's bristles enables larger, solid shapes to be painted. The small round number 5 brush is a versatile brush that's small enough for detailed work. You can use the tip of the bristles or paint with the entire bristle head. Like the rigger, you can use the number 5 to make zigzags for grass and such like. But the line width varies depending on pressure applied to the brush. And it's good for squiggles of varying widths depending on pressure on the brush. Drop shapes are achieved using the shape of the bristle head. While rolling the bristle head gives gently undulating broad lines, good for sky and clouds. Using very little paint on brush gives broken colour and a scrubby texture. Controlled shapes can be made by painting the outline with the tip, then dragging colour to fill in. Good for natural shapes such as trees and bushes. Straight, regular lines can be made with the number 5 by applying even pressure to the brush. By contrast, it can also be used to make broad marks by using 2 brush strokes for each mark. Essentially, the large, round number 8 brush is a bigger version of the number 5, but the number 8 is versatile enough to cover large areas quickly. For instance, by using the broad side of the bristles, you can quickly get an area of solid colour with the number 8. An undulating line where the thickness varies considerably is possible by varying the pressure on the brush. Straight lines of even width are possible using even pressure on the brush. Short, flicking strokes give curved flecks, while a spattered texture is produced by shaking the brush abruptly over paper. Using the tip of the brush gives dots of regular size, while regular flecks and streaks are made using controlled strokes. Finally, imprinting with the number 8's bristle head can allow petal shapes to be created. The flat 3/4 inch brush can be used in 2 distinct ways. The broad bristle edge is used for wide marks and large areas of colour. The narrow edge is used for lines and fine marks. By combining both wide and narrow marks from the flat brush, you can create specific shapes. Here, a cypress tree. Regular marks using the broad edge of bristles can be used to create the look of brickwork. A zigzag is made using the narrow edge of the bristles. Petal shapes are created by dabbing the brush in a circular pattern. Using the brush sideways on, larger regular marks are created by applying some pressure to partially flatten out the brush. These look like water lily pads. Using the tips of the bristles gives stippling, while squiggles can be made with the corner of the bristle head. By turning the brush while making a line, the width changes, giving an undulating effect. Finally, short, squarish marks are made using the broad edge of the flat brush's bristles. Fan brushes are great for painting large areas of texture quickly. They're available with either stiff or soft bristles. The stiff-bristled fan, which is normally used for oils and acrylics, is used here because it's more effective for creating textures. You can use the splayed bristles to create shrubby grass and foliage, as well as to make subtle textures. Use the fan bristles to paint foliage and branches. Then use the corner of the bristles to drag the colour to form the trunk. Dip the tips of the bristles in colour to create light, linear textures. Working in irregular strokes allows you to combine texture with solid colour. Stippling with the fan bristles gives another useful texture. Use the bristle tips to make curves and swirls using a circular motion. Finally, straight lines can be created using the edge of the fan brush's bristles. The Mop Brush's full head of soft bristle holds lots of colour and is ideal for washes and covering broad areas. The tip can be used for lines and details, but as a general rule, the mop isn't really suited to very fine work. Use the tip of the mop brush for random lines and zigzag marks. The tip is also useful for large dabs and dots. Sweeping lines of strong colour can create large, natural shapes, such as a palm leaf. By rolling the head of the mop, you can paint areas of irregular colour. Paint undulating lines by varying the pressure on the brush. Finally, use the shape of the mop brush's bristle head to dab large petal shapes. This project is based on a photograph, but doesn't attempt to be a realistic recreation of it. Instead, it shows how foliage, shrubby undergrowth and grass, subjects that often appear difficult, can be simplified to create an attractive and realistic interpretation of the original image. Don't worry about the seemingly complicated trees. Initially, just draw the main outline of the foliage, then use a combination of washes and brushwork to give them form. The painting uses wet on wet and wet on dry techniques and shows you how to build up layers of colour to create light and shade. A combination of brushes will help you create the delicate branches and mysterious outlines of the trees that form a cluster at the heart of the painting. Working from your photograph and using a 2B pencil on a sheet of stretched, not watercolour paper, create a light outline drawing. There's no need to add in detail, just a simple outline of the main areas of the image, the trees and the horizon line, marking the division between the grass in the foreground, the field and the sky. Mix plenty of washy sky colour from water, cerulean and cobalt blue. Test the colour on a piece of spare paper to make sure it's not too dark or too pale. Wet the cloud shapes with clean water, then wash in the sky with the mop brush, rolling the brush to produce irregular marks. Paint around the wet clouds, but allow the colour to touch and run into the damp areas. Take the sky over the drawn outline of the trees. Allow the paint to dry. Mix brown for the trees from raw umber with touches of burnt umber and ivory black. Paint the trees with the rigger brush, using bold strokes for the main trunks and finer strokes for the smaller branches. Vary the brown by adding more colour in places to darken the shade and adding occasional touches of water to lighten the colour. Change to the number 8 brush and wash in the foreground using the same brown mixture, leaving a few flecks of unpainted paper. Allow the paint to dry. Add more ivory black and a little water to the brown mixture and paint the paler distant trees using the rigger brush. Mix yellow ochre and raw sienna with lots of water and use the number 5 brush to paint the distant field on the left of the composition. Mix dark green from yellow ochre, raw umber and a little sap green and wash in the masses of background foliage on the left using the rigger brush. Mix a darker green from sap green and ivory black and add dark shadows to the wet trees, painting around the trunks. Let the colours run and merge together. Leave flecks of sky colour to show through the foliage on the taller trees by working in diagonal and horizontal strokes. leave the painting to dry. Mix yellow ochre and raw umber and use the rigger to paint the long foreground grass in vertical strokes. Add burnt umber to the mixture and continue with the grasses. Use the palette green mixture and paint more grasses, allowing all the colours to run together. Change to the number 8 brush and use this to block in the larger grassy areas. Use the rigger to add more blades of grass. Leave the immediate foreground unpainted for the time being. Allow the painting to dry. Darken the grass mixture with more burnt umber and paint the shadows under the trees. Change to the fan brush and use this to paint the shrubby texture in the foreground. Introduce sap green into the mixture and flood this bright grassy colour into the foreground using loose brush strokes to get a nice spontaneous effect. Add dioxidine purple to the brown palette mixture and work in a few deeper shadows between the grasses. Generally darken some of the grass shadows using the deepest palette mixtures. Change back to the fan brush and strengthen the foreground. Add dioxidine purple and burnt umber to the dark mixture and strengthen all the shadows under the trees using the rigger brush. Allow the painting to dry. Mix sap green with a little raw umber and Payne's grey to make a rich, deep green. With the rigger brush, start to dot in the foliage on the trees, working from left to right so as not to smudge the wet colour as you paint. Apply the paint in rapid dots and dashes, joining the strokes to get the effect of leaves and branches. Leave patches of sky showing through between the leaves. Vary the density of the dots to get a natural appearance. Paint some areas as solid colour, especially the thicker foliage on the underside of the branches. For the larger tree in the centre of the painting, change to the fan brush. The splayed bristles enable you to work more quickly, painting a whole branch with one short downward stroke of colour. Generally develop the background using the fan brush again on the other tall tree and varying the colours and textures using palette mixtures with the rigger brush. Use the fan brush to add feathery details and the rigger brush to add distant tree trunks in shadow in shades of green. Use the bright green tree colour and the fan brush to paint some vivid grasses in the foreground. Mix 2 washes. The first is a very dark green mixed from ivory black and sap green. The second is a very dark brown from burnt umber and dioxidine purple. Dip the brush into the dark green and dab the darkest shadows into the tree foliage. Don't overdo these, you need just enough to give depth to the foliage. Alternate between the fan and the rigger to suggest leaves and branches. Leave some of the distant trees without any shadow at all. Use the second wash, the dark brown, to paint the tree trunks, allowing the dark green and dark brown to run together where the two colours meet. Everyone understands that red and yellow make orange, that blue and yellow make green, and that red and blue make violet. But because there's more than one yellow, one red or one blue on the palette, more than one green, orange or violet can be made. Here are some simple mixes to show the variations that are possible, using 2 reds, cadmium red and alizarin crimson, 2 blues, cerulean and ultramarine, and 2 yellows, cadmium yellow and cadmium lemon. Start each mixture by putting a little water in the palette. To make a cool orange, mix alizarin and cadmium lemon. A bright orange can be obtained from a mix of cadmium red and cadmium yellow. When it comes to greens, a mix of ultramarine and cadmium yellow makes a muted green. While cerulean and cadmium lemon make a bright leafy green when mixed together. And 2 quite distinct violets are possible. When you mix alizarin and ultramarine, the violet produced is bright. But mix cadmium red and cerulean and you get a duller colour altogether. When you want to create a watercolour based on an existing image, such as a photograph, there's a simple technique that can allow you to quickly make a relatively accurate pencil sketch of the picture on your paper. You'll then have an outline of the image to follow when you apply your paints. This technique is called gridding or gridding up and involves drawing a grid of evenly spaced vertical and horizontal lines to create corresponding squares on both the image and on your watercolour paper. When making your sketch, you then simply transfer the detail from the original to the blank paper one square at a time, which is much easier than drawing the whole thing freehand. First of all, you draw a grid on the existing image or onto a good photocopy of it. Remember only to grid up a picture you don't mind covering with black lines. A grid on the original with squares 2 centimetres aside is a good size. So, using a ruler and a pen, make marks 2 centimetres apart on all 4 sides of the image. Now, using the ruler as a straight edge, connect the marks to make the grid. Now, draw a corresponding grid onto your watercolour paper. It's very likely that the paper will be a different size from the original picture, so a simple calculation might be needed to work out how long the sides of the squares need to be on the watercolour paper grid. In this example, the watercolour paper is twice as wide as the original, so the 2 centimetre squares on the original need to be scaled up to 4 centimetre squares. If it were 1.5 times as wide, the squares would need to be 3 centimetres aside, and so on. Using a 2B pencil, mark all 4 edges of the watercolour paper with marks the correct distance apart, here 4 centimetres. And then connect them up to make the grid using the pencil and ruler. Press lightly so the lines are visible, but the pencil has not scored grooves in the paper. You should end up with exactly the same number of squares and in corresponding positions on both the original and the watercolour paper. Now you simply move from square to square, drawing the contents of each one. Look at a square on the original and find the corresponding square on the watercolour paper. See what's contained within it and lightly draw it in. The squares make it easy to see where each feature of the original begins and ends, and helps you see how they fit within the square. It might take a bit of practice, but after a while you'll find it an essential technique for accurately creating a sketch from an image for you to follow. After the image has been sketched, you can erase the grid lines, leaving just the outlines for you to follow. Rural scenes are popular subjects for watercolourists, and pictures of the quiet beauty of the countryside have enduring appeal. For this project, you'll need to be using a number of the basic techniques, including laying washes, various types of brushwork, working from light to dark, wet on wet and wet on dry, plus sponging. This project is a rural landscape painted from a photograph. The composition is taken from one section of the photograph and is deliberately chosen so the horizon falls below the centre of the paper. This is done to avoid cutting the composition into two equal halves horizontally. Similarly, the tree is offset so the tree foliage and the sky area don't divide the painting into two equal halves vertically. Before you commence, create a light outline drawing. Between stages, the painting and board and painting are laid on a flat surface so the colours don't run downwards. The first bit of painting to do is the sky. Start this by using a mop brush to apply an irregular band of clean water across the sky area. Now mix a diluted cerulean blue and paint the sky using the mop brush. Leave patches of unpainted white paper for the clouds, allowing the colour to run where it touches the watery patches. Use a damp, natural sponge to soften the edges of the clouds by dabbing. Allow the painting to dry flat. Next, you need to mix the three diluted colours that you'll use to paint the ground in a series of washes. The first of these is cerulean, sap green and cadmium yellow. The second is diluted raw sienna. And the third is raw sienna and raw umber. Test each one on a separate sheet of paper to check the colour. With the mop brush, use the first wash to paint the green on the grass. Add a touch of the third wash and allow the two to run together wet in wet. Add a little of the second wash, again allowing the colours to run together. Now allow the painting to dry flat. It's time now to add the trees. Modify the first of the washes used for the ground by adding more sap green plus some burnt umber to get a dullish green. Also mix a small amount of stronger green from sap green and burnt umber alone. As usual, test your mixes on a separate sheet of paper. Use a combination of these two greens to paint the background trees with the rigger brush. Paint the hedges as irregular strips using both colours. Introduce dabs of palette brown mixtures into the wet trees and hedges to vary the colour in places. Allow the painting to dry flat. To give the trees and hedges shadows, mix a dark green from Payne's grey, burnt umber and sap green. Use a rigger brush to paint the trees in the far distance. Use the same mixture to add shadows to the rest of the trees, dotting in irregular shadows along the hedges. Add occasional touches of palette brown mixtures to the wet green, allowing these to run together wet in wet. Allow the painting to dry flat. To add more colour to the green grass, brighten the first tree mixture with raw sienna and more sap green. Using the number 8 brush, strengthen the fields and grassy areas on the left and right-hand sides of the picture and along the verge of the path with this colour. Leave the path unpainted for the time being. Allow the painting to dry flat. Mix raw sienna and raw umber and use the rigger brush to quickly paint the scrubby grass along the grass verges. Introduce occasional strokes of green palette mixtures to vary the colour. Leave flecks and slivers of paler underpainting showing through. Mix greenish brown by adding burnt umber to the green palette mixture and paint the dark shadows along the edge of the path using loose brush strokes to create the jagged edges. Use green and brown palette mixtures to darken the grass in the foreground. Allow the painting to dry. Add a little dioxidine purple to the darkest palette mixtures and paint the fence posts with the rigger brush. Remember the perspective, the posts get smaller as they recede into the distance. Still working with the rigger brush, use random crisscross strokes of shadow to darken the head shadows. Change to the number 8 brush, add sap green to the mixture and drop some of this into the foreground. Re-emphasize the side of the path, then dab a little stony texture onto the path with the rigger brush. Loosely paint the grassy path centre with the rigger brush using palette greens and browns and allow the mixtures to run together. Allow the painting to dry flat. Now for the tree, which you'll create by sponging. Mix plenty of dark green from sap green, burnt umber and Payne's grey. Wet a natural sponge and squeeze out the excess water. Dip the sponge in the colour and start to dab this onto the paper to make the foliage. Concentrate on the paler areas of foliage, the shadows come later. Turn the sponge as you work to avoid getting repeated patterns from the sponge. Allow the painting to dry flat. Darken the sponging mixture with more sap green, burnt umber and Payne's grey. As usual, test your mixes on a sheet of paper before using them on the painting. Dip the sponge in the mixture as before and start to sponge the dark green onto the foliage shadow areas. Use the rigger brush to drag the wet sponged colour to form clumps of foliage and smaller branches. Using the rigger, paint the main trunk and larger branches as areas of solid colour. Continue sponging and using the rigger until the tree foliage and branches are complete. Don't overdo the foliage and allow flecks of sky to show through the sponged and brushed leaves. There are just a couple of finishing touches left to do now. For the first of these, add cadmium yellow and cadmium orange to the palette green and use the rigger to paint the grasses under the fence. Finally, change to the number 8 brush and strengthen the foreground grass and the grassy verge on the path using loose horizontal strokes of sap green. The various techniques used in this entrancing country scene come together beautifully to give a finished work that speaks of calm days in a tranquil, timeless setting. An essential technique in the watercolorist's repertoire is the ability to apply watercolour to large areas. This is known as laying a wash. There are 3 main types of watercolour wash: the flat wash, where the colour is the same throughout, the variegated wash, where 2 or more colours are used, and the graded wash, where the colour goes from light to dark. All wash types can be laid with most types of brush, flat, round or mop. The brush you use is a question of preference, but it is important to choose a quality brush which holds plenty of colour, and to remember that the size of brush depends on the area to be covered. For the washes shown here, a mop brush is used. Before laying a wash, mix enough diluted colour to cover the whole area you intend to paint, as you can't stop partway through if you run out of colour. When you're happy with the mix for a wash, load the brush with colour, and working on a slightly tilted board, lay the colour quickly so the paint doesn't have time to dry or stain the paper before you've finished. For a flat wash, begin by painting a broad stripe across the top of the paper. Then work down the paper, applying the colour in broad stripes that slightly overlap each other, loading the brush after every 1 or 2 stripes. Remove the residue of colour at the bottom of the wash by drying the brush with tissue, and then dragging the bristles along the ridge of excess colour. For a variegated wash, mix the colours you'll be using before you start. Start by applying the wash in the first colour. To change colour, dip the brush in the second colour and continue working down the paper using the new colour. The 2 colours will run together to form a smooth, even blend. Remove any excess at the bottom, as for the flat wash. For a graded wash, lay a broad stripe of colour across the top of the paper. Then add a little water to the mixture and apply the second stripe, slightly overlapping the first. Continue working down the paper, adding a little more water to the mixture before applying each new stripe. The amount of water you add determines the degree of change from light to dark. Remove any excess colour at the bottom, as for the flat wash. 3 techniques that are used time and again by watercolourists are working from dark to light, and 2 variants of colour overlaying, the wet on dry technique and the wet on wet. There are some basic qualities of paint and paper that can be used to great effect. Colours are lightened by adding water, so, for example, diluted red gives pink, and so on. And the whiteness of the paper shows through the paint, which is in effect transparent to affect the final colour. One method of exploiting these basic qualities is called working from dark to light, to create a smooth gradient of colour from strong to faint. To practice this useful technique, start with the primary colours, red, yellow and blue. Apply a brushstroke of strong colour to the paper and add more and more water as you move across the paper until you get a very pale version of the same colour. The same principle applies to all mixtures and to all the colours on your palette. Applying paint to dry paper or over a dry colour gives crisp shapes with hard edges. However, if you apply paint to damp colour or damp paper, the paint spreads into the surrounding dampness to create soft shapes with blurred edges. When practicing wet on dry, apply a stroke of one colour, here red, over an area of dried colour, here yellow. The stroke retains its shape and the colours overlaid here make orange. When practicing wet on wet, apply a stroke of colour, here red, over an area of damp colour, here yellow. The colours merge to form a soft shape of mottled colour, here red, yellow and orange. Place the paper on the board. Cut the gum tape into 4 strips, slightly longer than the sides of the paper. Set the strips aside. Wet the sponge and apply plenty of clean water to the paper surface. Use the sponge to wet a length of tape and stick this along one side of the paper, overlapping the edge of the paper by about 1 centimetre. Repeat this on the other 3 sides. Smooth the tape and press down using the wet sponge. Leave the stretched paper to dry slowly and naturally on the board. It's then ready to use with no need to remove it from the board first. An alternative to paper stretching is to use a gummed block of watercolour paper. This is a pad of paper mounted on a stiff cardboard backing, gummed all round to prevent the paper from wrinkling. You work on the top sheet, don't need a board, and can remove the finished painting from the pad when it's dry. The pad has a tiny ungummed section, which isn't always easy to find. To remove the finished painting, insert a kitchen knife or scalpel into the ungummed section. Carefully run the blade around the edges of the painting to release the painting from the block.